This is But Tell Me How, the business podcast that gets to the point. It's a conversation about the ups and downs, the detail, and the reality of how to run a business, held at the Institute of Directors HQ in London. Joining us today is Greg Jackson, founder and CEO of Octopus Energy. Octopus Energy now supplies more than 7 million households in the UK and has renewable energy generation and technology services in 27 countries.
We wanted to do a technology platform and an energy company which would let us transform customer service, cost of operations, and innovation.
We talk about how Octopus Energy has transformed customer service in utilities.
I was like, well, so I have to phone up every year or you're going to rip me off? And that seemed like just such a broken business model, so customer unfriendly.
Now, I should say, I know Craig well. I first met Greg when I was part of the Octopus Capital Group that invested in Octopus Energy. We talk about all of this and more as Greg Jackson joins us on But Tell Me How. Greg, start off first with wildly successful business today. Octopus Energy has gone global, operating 18 countries and counting. But tell me about your background. How did you get going? Where did you come from? What kind of schools did you go through? How did you get to this a phenomenal success?
Thanks, John. Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think we can yet say we're successful. And I know we've had a lot of successes, but this match is still underway. And we don't know when it will finish or what the final result will be. So I'm really proud of it, but I'm also always conscious we're only as good as our latest delivery, our latest innovation, our latest set of numbers. But in terms of my background, I was born in Germany. My dad was in the British Army, and but my mum was a bit of a rebel. And instead of living on the base, we lived in the local village, and my mum learned to speak German. It was my first language. Sadly, all gone now. We moved back to the UK when I was about 3 years old. My dad started to work in construction, and then my parents split up when I was about, I think, 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
And from that age onwards, I was brought up by a single mum. When they got divorced, she had I don't think she had a job. She never really worked because she'd been an army wife. And suddenly had to put a roof over the heads of 3 kids and herself. She started working at a pub in the evenings, but then also studied by day to get a degree to be able to try to transform our lives. And
So not a privileged background in any way, shape or form.
no, in fact, we were extremely hard up. And I think there's a few things that come out of that. I mean, by the way, anyone who's a parent knows it's hard work. It's hard work if you've got 2 parents and you're earning a reasonable amount. It's really, for a single parent on very low income, it's brutal. What I learned there was a lot of resilience, but also no fear of having nothing, because we had nothing. So, and I think sometimes people sort of from a sort of more middle of the road background, or even a well-off background, are held back because they're worried about what they might lose. And so it can be a good strength to come from that. But I think then also, I saw this incredible amount of hard work Mum did to improve our world. And by the way, despite all of that, in her spare time, she also campaigned for things she cared about. So just it's amazing how much energy, a person can have. And I think, that's inspirational. And so when I hear people talking about how hard things are in work and things like that, very, very often we can dig deep and find enormous reserves to get more done. I'm always inspired by people who kind of just, achieve orders of magnitude more.
Do you think that's where your work ethic came from? I mean, you're famous for your very, very high work intensity. Is that part of it?
I think it is, yeah. But it's quite interesting. I think look, there's no judgment of people for whom, for example, work is a 9 to 5 thing, and people who work to live rather than live to work. But what I was brought up with was a different kind of world, a world where there was no spare time. Everything went into either kind of putting bread on the table, making ends meet, or building for a better future, or fighting for things you cared about. And so I think, for me, when people ask what I do in my spare time, it's like, I wasn't brought up in a world where spare time was a thing.
Yeah.
And when I get glimpses of it now, I realize it could be very addictive, and I go straight back to work.
So tell me your education, because I think you ended up at Cambridge, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So how did that happen?
I was lucky that I found school quite easy. In fact, I think one of the reasons I'm an entrepreneur is I quite resented being told what to do at school, and always wanted to be able to define my own path. One thing Mum did was I think it's the way she was time managing, but she said, look, the government give me a couple of pounds a week for each of you, to me and my sister, to buy clothes and necessities. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give the money straight to you, and from here on, you buy your own clothes. And of course, I didn't give monkeys about buying clothes. I saved up money and used it to buy bits of electronics, and eventually saved and buy my first computer, and learnt to write a hardcore computer code and build hardware. So I left school at 16 to write video games. I had a great time doing it, but at one point I went freelance. I wrote a game that took 2 months, 3 months, I can't remember. And then it was really no fun at all to play, so it didn't get published, which was entirely appropriate. The code was brilliant, but it didn't matter because it was no fun. And I think, I learned a lot there about the importance of delivering what customers want. What matters is, are you doing what they want, not what you want. But anyway, so I decided to go back to school, did some A-levels, and I guess when you think about where to apply for university, the sixth one said, you should think about Cambridge. I went to have a look with a friend. I've got to say, I was just blown away. It's incredible, huge, beautiful buildings. It was the middle of a droughty summer, and the grass was green, and it was just so aspirational. I really wanted to be there. It was like off a Hollywood movie. And I really loved it. I found some friends there that became friends for life. But I also met some brilliant people. Not to say that my friends aren't brilliant, by the way, but some other brilliant people. 2 of whom ended up being co-founders at Octopus Energy. So we may talk about that later. But
Right.
Those relationships and the extent to which I was exposed to an incredible array of people was wonderful.
So let's fast forward a bit to your time when you came to meet the Octopus folk. I was introduced to you by Simon Rogerson, who's the chief executive at Octopus. How did you sort of get started on Octopus Energy? What was the genesis of this, and how did you find the funding, etc.?
I'd gone on to build 3 or 4 businesses previously, and the last one we built before Octopus, we built enterprise software. Our biggest client was SAP, so it was quite hardcore stuff, but it was all built around how do you make enterprise software and any consumer-facing ends of it incredible experiences. And so we became really good at that. And when we sold that business, I bought a house and finally got around to opening an energy bill. And it was astronomically high. So I phoned up the energy company and they immediately cut it. And I said, well, how can you do that? And they said, well, you didn't have a contract with us. You just moved in. We didn't. Anyway, so it kind of made sense. But a couple of years later, I got around to opening a bill again. It was astronomically high. I phoned up the company and they said, they cut it. And I said, how can you do that? And they said, you're not in contract. I said, no, I am. I sorted this. They said, oh, no, the contract's only for a year. I was like, well, so I have to phone up every year or you're going to rip me off. And that seemed like just such a broken business model, so customer unfriendly. And then the more I looked at this kind of how energy companies behaved, what you could see was that a lot of their issues, bloated, expensive, terrible service, really traced back to bad systems. If you phone up, you'd speak to one person and then you get handed to another and another, and maybe someone would call you back. And it was because each of them were using different systems and the systems weren't properly joined up. And you think, like, if that's what it does to customer experience, imagine at the back end how many manual processes and what overhead and bloat they must have to try and stitch all this together.
What was the original pitch? What was the original idea you were trying to get funded?
It was to build a technology platform and an energy company which would let us transform customer service, cost of operations, and innovation, particularly in a world of changing energy because of renewables.
How were you so convinced that that was the right approach?
I think because we came from a technology perspective, you could see how you might take an organization that took thousands of people to run and do the back office and all that stuff, and really just do it with what I called a big effing robot, because so much of that can be done by modern software, and therefore there was a sort of an intuitive understanding that you could transform the economics. That is, you could probably offer consumers a better price, but also make more money. But you had to build the software. By the way, at the same time, and we saw with the emergence of things like Amazon or the iPhone, that when you get better technology, it opens up myriad new possibilities. So with Amazon, it wasn't just originally a bookstore with a very big range, but it had incredible recommendations. And so we could see in energy, you could not only do the basics of customer service better, but you'd be able to innovate in all kinds of ways. For example, giving people cheap electricity when it's windy or sunny. Once you put the software in, you would be able to do loads of stuff no one else could do. We just didn't know what that would be.
Yeah.
But by the way, John, just to cut on, you shouldn't feel bad about that, because in my previous business, especially after we'd sold it, quite a lot of young people, not always young actually, but came to me with ideas. And every time I had data from experience in the sector they were thinking about, it actually caused me to reject great startups. So literally someone came to me a couple of years before Tinder existed and pitched what was basically Tinder. And I previously had clients who were in online dating. I said, this will never work. No one wants to do casual dating. It's all about getting a relationship, because that's what the data said. But of course, the data only worked for the existing companies, not for what you could create in the future.
Well,
and that's what I got wrong.
So it's interesting thing. So what actually happened in the conversation, you came along with this amazing pitch. It was fantastic. And I said to you, well, this will never work because there's no money in it. You just won't be able to actually make it get going. And of course, and I also knew you need to be big to be successful in energy. You need to have lots of customers. I thought that was going to be very expensive to get lots of customers. So I think I said, actually, I think this is a really daft idea. And you very patiently sat me down and said, no, John, we're going to create this software as a service platform to actually run the energy company. And it's going to be so cheap. I think I could actually make money at only 2% gross margin. And that's when I said, okay, well, if you could do that, maybe it's possible. And that's how it started. It was a great start.
That's great, John. I think, look, since then, by the way, you've been incredibly supportive and helpful. And I remember another thing you said early on, though, which was when you get to 1 million customers, everything gets easier because people have heard of you. And we have relentlessly found that to be the case. And that really we had to sprint and work so hard to get to the first 1 million. And we still work unbelievably hard, but the return on that now, and I don't mean the financial return, I just mean the ability to win and look after and deliver great service for customers has got easier and easier beyond that 1 million figure, exactly as you said.
One other bit of the story, which I think people from outside possibly don't know, is that early on in the Octopus piece, we could have actually sold a stake in the business and got our money back, and then would have had still had a majority stake and everything else. But we chose not to. We chose to actually keep going with you. What was that like, being on the other side of that with your backer who decided to keep going?
In business, you get a lot of surprises, but it's not symmetric. About 80% of them are negative. And so I don't think it's that uncommon that you have to go to your investors and say, hey, look, we've either got to temper our ambitions or we're going to need more backing. I think investors often know this, but it's always still a very difficult conversation.
One of the things which I think our viewers would be interested, or our listeners would be interested in, is, but how did you find us? How did you find the first check from Octopus?
So we'd sold our previous business and very quickly were interested in whether or not we could build something in energy. And we actually put a notice on a notice board at London Business School, offering the opportunity for some MBA students to do their final project, building the business plan for a technology-based energy company. We found 3 great students, and we paid them. So it was a proper win-win. But the outcome of their business plan was that to do what we wanted to do with our ambition would take at least £10 million of funding. And given we had no experience in the sector, and all we had was a PowerPoint, even if it was a good one, I didn't really have the confidence to go knocking on investors' doors and asking for the money. So I actually kind of shelved the idea and got on with some other kind of entrepreneurial things. But at some point, maybe a couple of years later, someone we both know, Stuart Quickenden, who was then at Boston Consulting Group, which I think you were at previously.
Yes, I was at BCG too.
Yeah. He introduced me to Simon Rogerson, the founder of Octopus Investments, and just said, you two should have a cup of tea. I had no idea what it was about, but it seemed like a good idea to have a cup of tea. So we had a cup of tea. And during that conversation, I think it turned out Simon was looking for kind of new advisors or even directors or something of his business. during the conversation, it turned out that I knew that Octopus already had a great tech ventures investment arm, but it also invested quite a lot in energy and especially in renewables. So I just kind of explained to Simon this idea we'd had, and metaphorically, blew the dust off the business plan and handed it over. And suddenly this spark emerged, and I think it was literally 5 weeks from then to the point when we shook hands on a deal. So and I could not have met a more supportive investor who understood entrepreneurs so well. And then, of course, that it meant we ended up meeting you and the rest of his group. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I didn't actually know that bit of the story, so that fills me in a piece too. Just explain to me how would you go around thinking about a pitch to a group of investors? Because it's quite a big commitment. I think we committed to something like £50 million, and not all in one go, but in slices. So what did it feel like on your side to go and make that pitch?
First of all, it's really important for entrepreneurs to remember that investors are backing them and their ideas. As soon as you get into some sort of co-creation, it's going to be a disaster, because essentially a good idea is quite fully formed in your head, and it's all interconnected. Now, as soon as you try and explain it, you can only ever explain bits of it. And if people start tinkering with those bits, actually the holistic idea starts to fall apart. And so I think quite a lot of people who are just becoming entrepreneurs and speaking to investors for the first time feel that what they have to do is accommodate the investors' ideas as well. Now, some of those ideas may be okay, but the main thing is having confidence, in fact, making sure you've got a fully formed idea and a vision, in which case you can have the confidence that, look, if you hear a good idea, by all means incorporate it. But you shouldn't be compromising to take the money, because in the short term, you may all feel good, but in the medium term, it's far less likely to be successful. And so I think what might come across as sort of having that confidence really came from the fact we'd done a load of work. And what we knew is we had an idea that really stacked up well. And if you were going to back that idea, that's great. But if you're not going to back that idea, then, let's not even have the conversation.
Move on.
Let's move on, yeah.
And how many people did you pitch the idea to before you found Octopus?
When I realized that Simon, or Octopus, was so perfect for us, I then blew the dust off. Until I'd met you, I just hadn't met anyone who's perfect.
What did perfect mean to you? But just go through the detail of what was great about that.
So perfect was, you've got a great track record in backing successful UK businesses with tech at the heart. You'd invested in Love Film, Zoopla, quite a lot of British success stories. SwiftKey. You kind of understood the kind of tech businesses we could build in the UK. A lot of them had a strong consumer face. The ones I've just named all had great brands. And so we had always from the beginning, we wanted to build a consumer-led, consumer-facing business, not some sort of financial engineering. And then your experiences in energy and in tech meant that we knew that once you had invested, you'd be able to be with us through the ups and downs of building a business.
So we knew how the renewables market worked. We understood how the energy market worked, etc.
Yeah.
So that was attractive. Okay.
And we didn't want to lean on your expertise, but what it meant was, experience tells me that if the investor understands the world you're in, then, for example, when things are challenging, they'll understand and be able to come to their own judgment on whether or not they should keep backing you in. That's really important, I think, for an entrepreneur. But then the other bit was on the chemistry side, and in particular, Simon, but all of you are people who understood how to back an entrepreneur in, for example, not micromanaging, but instead giving the space. And of course, you had deep enough pockets. So it was really important when we began this journey. What we didn't want to do was end up in a sort of situation where energy is a volatile market. In fact, we saw what happened during the gas crisis to so many companies. And we wanted to make sure we had enough capital to ride every wave. In fact, to be prepared before the waves and to ride any waves, because we wanted to build a business with a sort of global perspective. And that meant we really needed to have enough capital behind us and enough personal backing. And you provided both of those.
Yeah. And I think what was interesting, 3 or 4 years later, we actually ended up in a situation where I think at that time we maybe had put £100 million into the business. And there was a discussion actually in our board about whether or not we should go out and get, a private equity firm or another VC firm to put money in. But we actually chose to keep going with you to actually put in another 50 million, which was for Octopus was a very large amount of money. 150 million was a very significant portion of the net worth of the group. What did that feel like, having somebody sort of really back you to that degree at that stage?
We're never under any doubt that we have a deep responsibility to deliver success for those who put faith and indeed financial backing into us. And obviously at that point, Octopus was hugely backing us. But we also never had any doubt that we're building something of phenomenal value. A lot of the reason we needed that backing was that we were growing bigger and faster than our business plan had suggested. And that's a good problem to have. But we'd much rather have had, you than had to go out and just find some arbitrary capital, because I think, you guys had the ambition to back something huge. And the risk always when particularly if you're looking to plug a gap, is that you end up with someone whose vision's not aligned. So from our perspective, we were confident that, in fact, we knew it was delivering huge value for you, but it was also getting to the point that, you were putting an awful lot of backing in.
Yeah.
Today, I'm over the moon that it's undoubtedly the case that you've had a phenomenal return as a group, and you deserved every bit of that. I think Simon and the rest of you came to a view that, you get these opportunities every now and then as an investor to really do something that, is your 100x or 1000x opportunity. But it takes confidence. And that's the kind of confidence you often see from US VCs.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the US has, among other reasons.
So interesting. You may not know this, but actually the board meeting where we decided to actually up again, I think there was different views around the table about what we should do. Some people were very keen on taking money from outside because it reduced our risk, but we still had a significant stake. But in fact, we chose to up again. And the conversation was just like that, which is, if you find something amazing, then you've got to continue to back it.
I mean, first of all, there's a great quote from Jeff Bezos who says, we've made big bets, colossal bets, but never bet the company bets.
Yeah.
And I think that bit where, you put enough in, it will hurt if it doesn't work out, but not so much that it'll endanger you is appropriate. And I do think that we often ask why the UK hasn't created as many, colossal growth businesses as the US. And I think that mindset is one of them. And the VC mindset is, I'd rather have a 1% chance of 1000x return than, a 50% chance of a 20% return. And I think, I'm not saying there's anything wrong, by the way, with other risk preferences, but there's a shortage in the UK of those who are willing to really lean into, a reasonable number of opportunities, knowing that some of them will hit it out of the park.
Yeah, I think people get worried about that risk concentration, but in fact, actually, risk concentration is the only way you can really make a great return, especially when you find a business like Octopus Energy. But what's the one thing which people haven't asked you, which you wish they had, because it was actually core to the success? What are the things which people just don't ask you about?
Well, I said earlier that it's really important to have the confidence when you're pitching your idea to investors, to maintain the holisticity of it. But there were 2 or 3 things that Octopus brought to us that weren't in the original business plan. One of them, by the way, was the name. We were going to be called Positive Energy. Octopus originally asked if it would be called Octopus Energy, which we didn't like.
You didn't like it?
No, because from a branding perspective, there was a real worry about tentacles, suckers. You imagine the press doing an image of tentacles around your wallet. You can see it's good, but we did loads of work in good spirit to try and get the make Octopus appealing. The answer, by the way, inspired by a combination of Disney and the ghost in Pac-Man, was big eyes, short tentacles, and smile.
Well, I was actually at the meeting when you launched the pink fluffy octopus to us, which I didn't realize the genesis of that. So that's fascinating.
That was great fun. And actually, by the way, just before making the investment, someone at Octopus said, actually, probably best not call it Octopus Energy. And we were like, we're calling it Octopus Energy. So, in this world where people get obsessed by, huge amounts of effort they're going to sort of, brand definition.
Yeah.
Honestly, and Kraken, by our software platform, is now worth, $5-10 billion.
Yeah.
Literally, one of the software developers just stuck the logo on the screen one day.
And called it Kraken.
And called it Kraken. In fact, they replaced the login button with, instead of enter, they replaced it with unleash the Kraken. And I said, if that's there by the end of the day, that's what the platform is going to be called, and we'll never be able to change it. And that's what happened. So again, all our great brands happen like that. But I think the bit I was going to say though that was really definitive was our original business model was Ryanair for energy, and that would be it's 100% automated. If you do everything the way we stipulate it, you'll never get cheaper. But and by the way, that definition of customer service, it'll never be cheaper, and it will always work. It's 100% online, no phone calls. Very much like with Ryanair, where everything works as long as you turn up when you're supposed to, with the QR code you have to, without the bags you shouldn't, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But Simon Rogerson said to me, he said, "Look, I love all of this, but you should give the best service in the industry." Like he said, that is what will define your difference. And I think coming from a tech perspective, we hadn't thought enough about that.
So that's very fascinating to me, because the service part of it never really, I didn't realize that was actually not part of the original vision, but came from actually the discussions we had along the way. That's extraordinary.
It was, and I think I reflect on this with great humility, because today, that has, in fact, for the last 7 or 8 years, that has been our defining difference versus other companies. And actually, that was the bit in the investment conversations. There was a suggestion that we could build into our holistic vision because we deliver it through technology. But that's ended up being our great differentiator.
And of course, incredibly helpful economically, because it meant your customers didn't churn off.
Traditionally in energy, companies would lure in customers on a loss leading price. I mean, literally losing a few £100 on that price. And then hike it a year later to something astronomical to recover the losses they made, to recover the comparison site fees they were paying, and to deal with the fact that about half the customers who joined them left after a year because they saw this hike. And it just seemed so inefficient. So our original model always revolved around bringing people in on a price that meant that they wouldn't have to leave a year later. It would be long-term fair.
And so when did you realize that actually that was going to work? Because it wasn't obvious that right at the start it was going to be that case.
It's much harder to win customers when you're not offering an unsustainable price.
Yeah.
But once you've won them and they realize they're not going to get ripped off, then they can relax and stay with you. But our duty is therefore to look after them in every way through value, service, and innovation relentlessly. But in return, I think rival companies often still lose, 50% of customers after a year. And so they've got to recover all that cost from their existing customers. Whereas for us, where I think we might lose, between 5 and 15%, we don't have that massive economic dead weight. And instead, we can share the benefits of a more efficient business with customers.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now to talk about some of the aspects. You famously, and you don't have an HR department. So can you just talk to me through about why did you make that decision, and how does that change the culture of the business? Why is it useful?
This is no slight on HR departments, or indeed the phenomenal HR professionals that I meet frequently and indeed have met through my life. But there was a general observation I had that when you build a small business, and I've started quite a lot of companies, when there are 5 of you, you don't have an HR department. When there are 10, you don't. When there are 50, you don't. And so it became, how do you scale that kind of management where managers have to take responsibility for their people as well as for their business results? And so we came up with this idea that we'd create a constraint on ourselves, that by not having that as a department, we had to be able to train and develop managers to do the full job and to be more like entrepreneurs. And so today we've built this business of 10,000 people where managers have to be fully rounded entrepreneurs. But I've got to say, we do have people in the company that do recruitment, that do training. But typically these are all done within the function. So within operations, they'll have their own training programs and stuff like that.
So how many people though work at Octopus Energy now?
So about 10,500.
10,500. So I suppose people who scaled up to that size, and actually even smaller companies, would be worried about the HR legal risks, etc., which you get with those. How did you get through that?
Yeah, I think I often get asked about this. And of course, I've seen blogs where people say, well, clearly they've never had any. It's like, of course we get issues.
Yeah.
But first of all, managers can reach out to internal experts. We've got lawyers internally. We've even got some people internally that are experts in employment rules. And they can reach out to them as they choose. The difference, or they can reach out to external advisors. But the difference is they haven't subcontracted, and we as a company haven't subcontracted that responsibility to a function. As a result, managers can't be slapdash and slipshod on stuff, or it will show up very, very quickly. And on the the legal side, companies with HR departments have those issues too.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make them go away. It's just you handle them differently. And I think the way that they get handled in this, once a manager's had to deal with a tricky employment case, they'll take a lot more care in future.
What have been the sources of inspiration in your career? Any mentors that have shaped your work?
Well, I'm very brief on the HR point. There was the HR director of Procter & Gamble when my first job after university, a guy called Dennis Schuler, who essentially ran the tiniest HR department and created this world in which I think in our appraisals, 50% of the mark came from how well you looked after your team or helped build the organization, i.e. building this kind of idea of devolved HR. But then I think outside of the company, I hesitate to mention someone like Elon Musk because of obviously they kind of
Comes with a lot of baggage. Yeah.
there's a lot of baggage there. But the reality is there are 2 or 3 things there that I think we should all be inspired by. One is the relentless confidence to go back to first principles. So when everyone else says you can't build electric cars, looking at first principles, saying, hang on, batteries are getting cheaper. The average drive is relatively short. Power electric car so much more cheaper than a petrol car. We can create and their performance is off the charts. We can create a compelling electric car and use that to transform an entire sector globally. And similarly, I think on rockets, going back to this thing about why aren't rockets reusable? And reinventing the way the rocket works, and as a result, SpaceX is 18 times cheaper to launch than NASA. And by the way, off the edge of SpaceX, building Starlink. I think in the first 60 years of humans putting satellites in space, we put 4,000 in space. Starlink has since put 6,000. One company has increased the number of satellites
Extraordinary.
that every government in the world collectively have done by 50% in 6 years.
Yeah.
And I think this relentlessly going back and reinventing things. I think the second thing on the Musk, though, is just on a personal level. We all think we're productive. I don't know how many jobs he's got today. And when people will say to me, look, Greg, hasn't Octopus grown quite quickly? Can you still carry on this pace of innovation and delivering quality? And I'm like, look, if I compare us to, for example, what happens in those companies, actually we need to speed up and do more.
Well, he famously slept in the factory for a very long time in order to get the electric car business up and running.
Yeah, and to in fact, and to deliver on certain commitments and targets they'd made.
Yeah.
And that degree of personal ownership is really important. But I was going to also mention, there are other people in and out of business. I mean, we still got to admire Michael O'Leary at Ryanair. That reinvention of a sector, the reinventing the idea that the flagship airlines would all go and buy 10 A320s and then bargain for some cheaper Boeings in return and so on. He goes and buys 100 of the same plane. And what's interesting there is the extent to which it makes everything better.
No, well, I was on the board of EasyJet for a number of years, and we had the similar experience. And I remember we actually switched from Boeing to Airbus, and in one of the recessions, we had last 4 Boeings left, and we were under the gun because at the time oil prices were very high. And somebody said, no, these Boeings have got to go. And at the end of the year, there was 20 million of operating costs, which they couldn't really understand why had come out. And somebody said, it's the Boeings, and it had come out in all these little areas.
Exactly, everything goes back. So, but it's like you only need one set of spare parts.
Yeah. One set of training. Your pilots, it's much easier to schedule the pilots and everything else. It's
exactly.
an incredible
thing.
thing.
You can have spare parts at every location because you don't have to have parts for 20 different models. And I think this understanding that you can unlock astonishing efficiency through big decisions like that, it inspires me today.
When you were starting out early on, we had some unexpected spikes in energy prices. This is before the big crisis which came after the Ukraine war. That could have been very threatening to Octopus Energy. How did you cope with those kinds of unexpected cost issues, etc., in the business? How did you get through that?
First of all, one of my co-founders, Stuart, is the CFO. I met him at university. We're not friends. We don't socialize. We know very little about each other's lives. But I have huge respect for his capabilities, and his integrity is unquestionable. And by the way, we get on well. I mean, we're just not friends. Now, Stuart is a risk obsessive. And so although I'm always thinking about how can we build sort of a bigger, a more effective, more valuable business that does more innovative things. Every time I speak to Stuart, here's well, what's the risk? And so his job always is to be looking at every scenario that could go wrong and how we'll manage it.
Now, that's very interesting you should say that, because that's a pattern I've seen quite a lot, where the chief executive is glass half full and the finance director who works in partnership is glass half empty. Is that the kind of relationship which you have?
Yeah, it is. Now, don't get me wrong, though. I mean, still, he is, he wants to create something very valuable.
Yeah, growth-minded.
Exactly. Now, especially skill is risk. And similarly, by the way, I want to make sure that what we do has absolute resilience, is totally sustainable, and has great longevity. So it's not like you kind of, I shirk responsibility. In fact, ultimately, it sits with me. But as a team, it gives us this far greater degree of resilience against various scenarios. By the way, one scenario you should always worry about is if we don't grow, then we're not going to be relevant and valuable. That's a big risk as well. So, we're resilient against all. But the thing I was going to say is the model I always had in mind is if you lined up every participant in our industry, from the strongest to the weakest, we'd always be very near the front of the queue. And that means in any kind of market turbulence, actually,
You'll survive.
Yeah, and we'll see, long before anything gets to us, we'll have seen an awful lot of, kind of the impact on others.
But tell me a little bit about that relationship between the sort of finance director and the chief executive, and maybe your other team members. I mean, it sounds like it's very much a team game, that you actually have people playing different roles, etc. Is that important to you?
Hugely important. It's quite interesting. Early on, someone said to me, Greg, you got to make sure you don't have a team that are all like you. I was like, let me introduce you to the team. They could not be more different in personality, in style, and in strengths. The thing they've all got in common is integrity and intellect and commitment. But beyond that, both the founding team and indeed the wider team we built early on, that really are the core of management today, are very, very different people. For example, the other core co-founder was James Edison, the CTO, who again I met at university. We did our first tech project together in 1992, I think, maybe 93. But, again, we're not friends, we don't socialize, but he has incredible integrity. He's
probably also one of the most extraordinarily gifted technologists I've ever met.
I suppose he's got a brain the size of a planet.
Yeah.
And essentially, he's like the Richard Rogers of software, or the Norman Foster.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, he built this incredible architecture that is not just fit for purpose on the day we launch it, but for decades can carry the things we want to put into it and is extensible. But, the three of us, we have so little else in common.
What's interesting to me in business is that so often, especially in this world of celebrity, you get the celebrity chief executive, a bit like yourself, but actually in most great businesses, it's a team game, and it's actually the team which have made this really successful. I mean, do you subscribe to that point of view? Or?
I mean, absolutely off the charts. And I've experienced it. James and I previously built a business, in fact, the one that built enterprise software. And when we sold it to another company, eventually I left before James did. We'd always agreed we'd leave together, but I can't remember why we didn't. Doesn't matter. And we were going to set the next thing. But because I had left and he hadn't, we couldn't. So I went off to set the next thing on my own. And honestly, I thought I was a great entrepreneur. I understand the tech very well. I'd be able to hire another CTO. I'd find another co-founder. Never worked. Without James, I was 1/10 as effective as I was with James. Over time, building on this kind of learning, I think if I look at the team we've got today, and I honestly look at high-performing teams everywhere, you get exponential return from the longevity of a high-performance team. When you have a sort of churn and burn approach or hire and fire approach, you never get to the bit where you're really on song together.
Yeah, I think one thing that's impressive about your team and yourself, which is it's great people, but definitely much better than the sum of the parts. It is that benefit which you get from knowing each other so well, but also working so well together.
Honestly, it's like a sports team. A really good football team, a really good rugby team. They kind of know where each other are on the pitch. They know who's good at what. They know that how to interact with each other. It's so fluid, and we still have like WhatsApp groups where loads of our decisions have been made on the fly all the time, handing off to each other because we know intimately. But the other bit is you've got total psychological trust. So there's no politics among that team. I can't say there's none in the company, but I don't think there's a lot. But among that team, no one is vying for their position. They're all fighting for the company because they're secure in the knowledge that we built this team and we've kept it together for a long time.
Now, not everything in business is exciting. Tell me one boring thing which has been really important, but which, again, people don't ask about.
Yeah, so look, I believe in relentless management. And so ever since we started, we do our Monday morning management meeting at 8:30. And by the way, I probably prefer to do it 8 or at 7:30, but other people's circumstances won't allow. But I think it's so important, week in, week out, to go through the detailed operational topics. And so we don't have a fixed agenda, but the night before we have 100 or 200 pages of data delivered to us, and we consume that, and then we talk about the most important topics out of it on a Monday. And by the way, 80% of that is about customer service, customer outcomes, innovation, things that will drive that.
That sounds very familiar to me. You'll not be surprised to hear that when I was at Tesco, we had very similar approach, that relentless approach to driving for success in that way.
Yeah, and I think British retailers of that, certainly of that era, were kind of globally, recognized for being so operationally brilliant. And it's that was an inspiration to me, by the way. When I was at Procter & Gamble, we worked opposite those retailers and just saw how unbelievably well managed they were.
Very focused.
And I think, by the way, we tried to emulate them in a couple of other ways. So Kraken, the technology platform, was partly inspired by this idea that I always noticed when a new CEO took over a retailer, within weeks you'd see improvements. And that's because they can walk the floor, they visit the stores, they talk to the staff and the customers, they can see what's on the shelves. But in a service business, you can't see that. It's all invisible. It's all trapped in the call center or in, kind of live chat. And what we did with Kraken was make it, I called it CEO proof, so that every conversation is visible, so that every manager is expected to log in frequently and be helping customers themselves. So I can see if someone's emailed me and it looks like they've had bad service, I can log in at Kraken and I will see that we dropped the ball, and I can learn what we're getting wrong operationally we need to fix. And that's what we talk about in the Monday meetings. Now, that's relentless.
Gosh, it's really funny. You're giving me not PTSD, but you're giving me flashbacks, because that's how I was trained at Tesco. And so I started a business called Tesco.com, which people might know. But what was interesting is the way we made that business successful was exactly the same thing. We had complete visibility of all the errors and problems, and we spent all our time fixing the business model so those things were eliminated.
I expect people, senior managers, to look after customers themselves, not just delegate it.
Yeah.
And similarly,
I used to ring people back up in the car as I was driving home. I would take a couple of numbers of somewhere we'd completely dropped the ball and actually talk to them about what had happened and how we were going to fix it. And most people actually couldn't really quite believe that it was you calling, but it was a very important and helpful way to actually get through those issues. It's great. You've built this amazing business, Kraken Technologies, which is the platform which you run both Octopus Energy on, but lots of other utilities work. Just tell me a little bit about that journey and why that business is such a great thing.
I think when we were building enterprise software, we spent a lot of time looking at why software transformations failed. So time and again, large companies will embark on a software transformation and they'll expect huge benefits, and the program will drag on for years longer than it should. It will cost tens or hundreds of millions more, and then doesn't deliver the benefits. What we identified there was that most enterprise software is like Jenga. You've got a big stack of different bits all kind of fit together, and if you pull any one out, the whole thing falls over. And so it makes it really, really hard to try and modernize your systems. And that the answer was actually to be able to build an entire new system that was as close as possible, one holistic software stack.
But how did you know to do that?
When we analyzed where things went wrong, it went wrong because whenever you're in a normal organization, a traditional legacy organization, you're continually replumbing all these bits. You've got thousands of consultants, each of them know their own bit of the stack, and trying to get anybody to understand how it all fits together is nearly impossible.
Right.
So if you can build one stack, all in the same technology, all in the same software language, all with the same single data set, you could simplify things to an inordinate degree.
So did that mean then you need much less developers, your architecture team is much smaller and all that other stuff? It must have had huge knock-on benefits to the way you develop.
It was just like this conversation we had about simplifying an airline fleet. Although imagine a typical enterprise, instead of having Boeing and Airbus, you've got 100 different vendors, right? You've got all these different generations, and you try to make all that work. When you've got Kraken, you have Kraken. And that means that, first of all, your operations are simpler. You can become much more agile. So a Kraken client, it's essentially like having an operating system, like having iOS or Android on your phone. The client can build apps on that, so they've still got all the independence they want, but all of their core software systems and data are in one stack.
And
we'll maintain that.
constantly being updated.
Yeah, in fact, Kraken gets updated 200 times a day. So you imagine, like, traditional enterprise software, you've got a monthly release. Here we got, it's continuous, and that means that each change is small. If there's ever any issue, you can roll back, and you're literally going back 10 minutes of work, and you can restore all the data. There's never any loss. But it also means that migrations are safe, because what you do is you have an empty Kraken. It takes us a few weeks to set one up.
Yeah.
But it's got all the processes for a business. And then all you do is move one customer over and one member of staff, and then 10 customers, 10 members of staff, 1,000 customers, 10,000. And then the migration is literally moving 100,000 customers a day from your old world to a new one. You shrink down your old world and lose all of that legacy.
No, it is an extraordinary thing you've achieved there. Quite incredible.
Yeah, and so I'm really proud, because I think we've done 40-ish migrations, all pretty much on time and budget, and transforming the client organizations.
How long does it typically take for a utility to transition onto Kraken? How long typically?
So anything from sort of 6 months to a couple of years. But it traditionally might have taken 11 years for a partial migration in the past.
Yeah.
But the fastest we've done was when we acquired Shell Energy, and we moved 1.5 million customers from Shell onto Kraken in 51 days from start to finish, and with no interruption. So I've had loads of Shell customers talk to me about just how seamless it was. But I think this isn't an accident. It came from that technology.
Fundamental design principle.
Yeah.
Really good. What's next for you in the business? Where are you going next? What's the big plan?
I mean, one of the great joys about being a private company is we don't have to publish our strategy and results. However, because we're in a regulated sector with so much government involvement, I'm very open about what we're trying to achieve. So, today we're the largest electricity company in the UK, but so we've got about 25% market share, but only about 5% of households have got what we call low carbon tech. So heat pumps, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicle chargers, electric vehicles. So our mission in the UK is really to be driving those technologies. Now, to do that, we've got to keep pushing down the cost and improving the customer experience. To the extent that, for example, we bought a company that manufactured heat pumps. We redesigned them. We now manufacture and design our own. We build our own hardware and optimization software. By the way, outside of what we do in the UK, so we're building our retail business, Octopus Energy brand business, as in other countries, to the same scale. So in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, Japan, we've got businesses growing at roughly the same scale. Relentlessly driving Kraken, which we license to other companies, and today, powers 66 million utility accounts globally, is contracted for that. I said we had a target of 100 million by 2027. So
sounds like you're going to make it.
Touch wood, yeah, it's looking okay. By the way, but not complacent about that. But relentlessly creating this kind of, I think it's the only, we call it next gen platform, cloud-based platform for utilities globally. It processes absolutely astronomical amounts of data to optimize energy systems and provide better service. But we've got to make sure that we don't get complacent. We've got to keep it absolutely ahead of the game.
Yeah, that's really good. Now, before the age of 30, it sounds like you had a number of small businesses, or started a number of small businesses. Tell me one piece of advice you'd give to the young entrepreneurs out there who are starting off in the business. What are the things which you wish you'd known at the age of 30?
Being confident in the face of advice. So you should never be arrogant, and you should soak up all the advice you can get, but then relentlessly judge it and critique it before you take it on board. So one example would be, you'll often hear as an entrepreneur, as a founder, people will say, what got you here won't get you there. This has worked very well so far, but it's not going to work going forward. Honestly, every time I've ever heeded that advice, it's been wrong, and I've regretted it. Because actually, the magic of what you do is what you got you here. And the magic of what you do is what will get you there. Now, you can make your choices about what you're going to do differently, but they should not be what other people say. And if I look at the great global growth stories, so many of them had the same vision that you develop as a leader. And of course, I spend my time very differently now than I did when we had 5 people. But what we haven't done is tried to turn into a traditional corporate. And if you look at whether it be Amazon or Apple or Tesla or Facebook, they were all grown by the same people that started them to that global scale.
And also by doing things differently. As you quite rightly say, I mean, I had the privilege of working at Apple for a very short time, but that company runs in a very different way than most corporations. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's so successful.
I think it's entirely right. And I think being confident, for example, you'll often have people advising you, there's someone really great, they've done this for this big company, and now they'll be able to do it for you. And it's like, actually, when they arrive there, they're going to be expecting all the machinery they had at that big company, because that's how they know to get stuff done. And none of that machinery will be here. So they're either going to flounder and, by the way, crystallize and it'll be painful and political, or they're going to start trying to build that machinery. But the machinery for example, of a typical big company was designed for whatever job it had to do over the last 20 or 30 years, not the job you've got to do over the next 5 or 10 years.
Okay, Greg, well, thanks very much for that. We'll wrap it up there. So thank you very much for talking to us. That was really fascinating. Thank you for coming in today.
Well, thank you, John. It's been honestly like one of the best conversations I've had about the business. Really appreciate your insights.
Not at all. I have to say that was a really helpful interview for me to actually really understand his success as an entrepreneur and founder of a really great business. I think there were 3 main takeouts though for me. The first one is the benefit of actually having a non-privileged background, to have the tough, hard scrabble to actually make things work. Clearly had made him a great entrepreneur. The second thing is he has complete confidence in his ideas and how they all fit together. That was his advice for all of us, and I think that's a really interesting perspective on making a business work. And then the third thing was his focus on his team, and actually how he had a team of people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, but how they all work together to make Octopus Energy a great business. Thanks for listening. This podcast is brought to you by the Institute of Directors and is produced by Econ Films. Head to IoD.com to join our growing community and gain access to opportunities for development, networking, and business support. Join me next time, wherever you get your podcasts, as I ask business leaders the question, but tell me how. And remember, the views in this podcast are those of the speakers, not necessarily the IoD.